everyone, we are from 11 ABM1 and welcome to our tutorial on problem number 5 on Fundamentals of Accounting 1. And this is our problem. Claro Venting operates the Venting Nursery School. It provides daycare, school bus service, and learning programs to preschool children. On January 31, 2019, the company's trial balance is as follows. So we have here the Venting Nursery School trial balance as of January 31, 2019. So first we have the cash, which amounts to 187,000 pesos, accounts receivable 170,000 pesos, equipment of 104,000 pesos, service vehicle of 1,740,000 pesos, notes payable of 1,500,000 pesos, accounts payable amounting to 164,000 pesos, and lastly, the Venting capital, which amounts to 537,000 pesos. So these are the beginning balances. And their total beginning balance is 2,201,000 pesos.
So these are the following transactions on the month of February. You can pause the video if you want to solve ahead. In the first transaction, the debit is rent expense because Ventic paid this month's rent for 27,000 pesos. The credit is cash because Ventic paid cash for his rent and the normal balance of cash is debit, and since Ventic paid cash, it now then decreases. In this transaction, the debit is cash because the customer paid the fees for the service rendered by the business. The credit is school revenue because the revenue increases because of the cash received. In this transaction, the debit is supplies because the business purchased supplies, so the supplies increase. The credit is accounts payable because in purchasing the supplies, it wasn't paid by cash, so it will be recognized as debt. In the transaction showed, the debit is gas and oil expense because the business paid the gas and the oil, then it is now recognized as an expense. The credit is cash because it decreased as the business paid. In February 6, it will be written as memo entry because the business ordered a playground equipment and because the business haven't received nor paid anything. Nothing happened in the transaction. In this transaction, the debit is accounts payable. The normal balance of accounts payable is on the credit side. Because the accounts payable decreases, you put it on the opposite side, so it's debit. The credit is cash because the cash decreases as he paid the remaining debt. In this transaction, the debit is cash because the business collected fees from the customers. The credit is accounts receivable because the normal balance of accounts receivable is debit, but the accounts receivable decreases, so you put it on the opposite side, which is credit. In this transaction, the accounts receivable is debit because the business rendered a service that has not been paid by the customer, and its credit is school revenues because the business haven't collected the fees, but it is recognized as revenue because the business rendered services.
In this transaction, accounts payable is debit because the business paid the supplies that was purchased on February 4, and as the cash decreases, it will be put in the credit side. In this transaction, equipment is debit because the business received the order made on February 6. The credit is cash because the business paid the equipment, and as the cash decreases, it will be put in the credit side. In this transaction, the equipment is debit because the business purchased equipment, and the credit side is accounts payable because the equipment wasn't paid by cash, so it will be recognized as a debt. In this transaction, the debit is utilities expense because the business paid this month's utility bill, and the credit is cash because it decreased as the business paid it through cash. In this transaction, the cash is debit because the business received the customer's payment that was billed before. The accounts receivable will now then decrease because of the payment received, so it will be put in the credit side. In this transaction, the salaries expense is in the debit side because the business paid salaries to the staffs. Cash will decrease and will be put in the credit side because the business paid cash for the staff's salaries. In the transaction showed, the debit is gas and oil expense because the business paid the gas and oil, and then it is now recognized as an expense. The credit is accounts payable because the business haven't paid the gas and oil that they bought. In this transaction, the debit is Ventic withdrawal because Ventic withdrew cash for personal use, and its credit is cash because the cash decreases.
So these are the journal entries as of the month of February. The next step is to make the accounts for the account titles used. Upon posting to the T accounts, you will base it from the journal entries. For each transaction, you will record the debit and the credit accordingly. Always remember that the debit is on the left side and the credit is on the right side. Additionally, do not forget to write the date for each transaction. After posting, you will subtract credit from debit or vice versa, and the difference will be put on the side of the normal balance of the account title. It is now your ending balance. Upon making the unadjusted trial balance, you will first put the heading, which includes the name of the business, the unadjusted trial balance, and the last date of the transaction. You will input all the account titles and their ending balances. Then finally, you total them to make sure if both the debit and the credit are balanced.